I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today, on this EV webinar, we have a fabulous list of speakers, which is going to be really interesting and thought-provoking. I'd firstly just like to introduce our speakers. We have Mr. Greg Steele, President of Global Mobility Arcadis. Greg leads Arcadis's mobility business line globally. In this role, Greg's main aim is to deliver Arcadis's mobility ambition of designing thriving and connected cities and communities. We will also have Simon Swan, Director of Future Mobility from Arcadis. Simon is focused on creating transport solutions for moving people and goods in the most sustainable way. Simon leads Arcadis EV solutions, including EV strategy, fleet electrification, and EV charging solutions globally. We have Hallie Liao, International Development Head of Shenzhen Bus Company. Hallie is passionate about public policy, public transport, and its role in creating a greener urban environment. Shenzhen Bus Group operates the world's largest electric-powered public vehicle fleet. We also have the pleasure of having Mr. David Maliki, Team Leader of New South Wales Net Zero Transport. David has been focused on climate change and environmental issues at state and federal level for over 15 years. In recent years, David has been involved in the significant statewide net zero emissions policy and program development, creation of New South Wales EV strategy, and currently leads New South Wales government delivery of $250 million in EV support initiatives. And rounding out the cast today is Luke Rust, founder and CEO of Outbound Australia. Outbound is a mobility service company that enables property operators to offer and access on-demand electric vehicles through a shared mobility platform. Thank you to all the speakers for joining us today, and I look forward to the presentations. First cab off the rank is Simon, who has woken up very early in the UK for us. Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. If you can enable me to be able to share my screen, I will start the presentation. Thank you. Just bear with me a second whilst I load that up.
That's come through, Simon.
Fantastic. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Simon Swan, Future Mobility Director at Arcadis, and I'm largely focused on the EV transition. And it's great to be connected with everyone on the call today. So a brief history, if I may, of the experience, the EV experience that we have in Arcadis. It started back in 2013. We started working for auto OEMs, in fact Nissan, and since then we've worked with lots of other OEMs. We've been working with oil and gas firms as they looking to transition from their traditional businesses through to energy and mobility firms. We've been working with charge point operators, with police and military fleet. In fact, we're working now with some ambulance fleets as well, working out how they're going to electrify those vehicles and all the challenges associated with that. We've been working with cities, municipalities, transport authorities, and we've been providing EV strategy. So we've been working out how they're going to transition, how they're going to embrace this EV, this big change program that we're all going through. And we've been working on workplace and destination EV solutions, and we've been working providing high power charging solutions as well for certain situations. And we recognise through doing all of this work since 2013 that there are really three key things for increasing mass EV transition. and they are largely infrastructure, the EV market, and government leadership and incentives. And let me just drill down into each one of these just for a moment. So in regard to infrastructure, you need the right infrastructure in the right place at the right cost. It needs to be accessible and it needs to be available. So my elderly mum, she needs to be able to see it and she needs to understand how to use it and access it before she will ever get an EV. The EV market must mature. My family car is a petrol SUV. I've got 4 kids and there just isn't an available electric vehicle for me that's on the market that I can buy that is affordable. So in fact, I use an electric bike to get around the city and reduce my CO2 emissions. And thirdly, the government leadership and incentives. So these are really important to create the market. So we created what we call a global EV catalyst index, and this helps to measure progress in 13 countries. It includes 2 US states, and these are the countries on the left-hand side here. And our index can be used to help focus investment priorities across products and services in relation to EV. And we focused on Arcadis countries. And when I say Arcadis countries, I mean countries in which we're actually delivering mobility projects. Okay, so we've got that experience on the ground, but we are actually expanding this. We're expanding to include Norway and Hong Kong and Turkey as well. And it's important to just point out that the index is only a snapshot in time. And already since last year, we've seen a huge amount of progress in many, many countries, including Australia. And the purpose of the index is to promote collaboration and to promote learning. And so how have we measured progress in the report? Well, we've looked at a number of different measures against each catalyst area, and then we've scored each country. So when it comes to government leadership and incentives, there is a few 4 areas that we've then drilled down to in a bit more detail, and we've been able to measure that in each one of the countries. And the single most important catalyst, as Investor says, is this area, government leadership and incentives, as it creates really good opportunities for investment. The ban on internal combustion engines, that's hugely important. Clients have been coming to us increasingly in the UK as the government announced that they were going to end the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030. And in fact, no one is buying diesel vehicles now in the UK. And in Australia, we're aware that some state governments have been making progress, but at a national level, there's still a huge opportunity to learn from other countries and avoid some of the mistakes that many have already made. For example, the monopolies that we've seen in the UK at motorway service areas, where competitors aren't able to install their charging infrastructure, and there's no clear policy on who should fund the grid upgrades, which are a significant part of this equation. Policy and regulations, are there national policies in place? The Australian policy titled Future Fuels and Vehicle Strategy will lead to 30% of all new car sales being electric by 2030, and at COP26, we're aware that Australia signed a global agreement to make electric vehicles a new normal by 2030. And when it comes to EV incentives, this is really important as well. So what is the financial or tax support for helping drivers switch to EV? In Norway, now it's cheaper to buy an EV than a diesel car. And whilst there is $250 million made available for infrastructure, with the price of batteries falling now because of the scale of this change, because they're falling, there's going to be price parity in 25-26 between EVs and internal combustion engines. And in only a few years' time, the government, the Australian government, can save money by not offering this, by simply allowing the market to catch up. And there's been so the other last point here has there been a net zero declaration, and this is important as transport contributes to 20% of emissions, so it's seen as relatively low hanging fruit. And clearly, as of October last year, in Australia, that's been set at for 2050. So the EV market, and it's moving really fast. It's been a very long time now since I've seen a Renault Twizy on the roads. Some of you might remember that. And broadly speaking, all OEMs now are offering EVs that genuinely look like cars, like they don't look weird anymore. And much of the EV market is related to government incentives and leadership and the infrastructure installation. And so the things that we looked at is how many EV registrations are there per capita, what is the market share of EVs compared to internal combustion engines, how many EV models are available, and how many EVs are there per capita. We're going to, if I was going to expand the study now, I would look at how many gigafactories are now being set up in particular regions. Infrastructure is what you see, and it's widely held to be the most influential catalyst, and especially according to the media. There's lots and lots of focus in on how many charge points have been installed. It's important to the media, and it's important to my mum. There are lots of opportunities when it comes from rolling out infrastructure programs. So other countries are able to learn from each other. And when I was working on the electric highway back in 2013, the failure rate of the charge points that we were installing there, the 50 kilowatt rapid chargers, at one stage was about 50%. So anyone moving in and installing infrastructure now won't suffer from those same early mistakes that everyone suffered from. So Australia will also have a better understanding now of the amount of power needed to get it right first time on site. We've been back to sites multiple times trying to request more and more power from the grid, but with the opportunity now to get it right first time. I would say now in some European countries, we're on the second or third generation of charging units, and I don't think the 7 kilowatt charger at the end of my road has actually ever worked. Okay. And there are numerous reports of damaged cables or chargers never being energized. We created an online tool. This is what it looks like. Have a look. It's on our website, and we will be expanding this, as I said, for Norway, Turkey, and Hong Kong. And we're working with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development at the moment and helping them create a similar tool. Very quickly, and I'm probably talking far too much, maximizing the impact of EV infrastructure. There's some really important things to consider here. If you're going to install infrastructure, what is going to be the impact of where you install that infrastructure on local congestion? If people are driving directly to that place to charge their cars, then what impact is that going to have? What is the impact on economic growth? We've seen a huge increase in, arguably, we've seen a huge increase in spend in the local area as people are charging their cars, they're going to the shops. Economic inequality, we want to make sure that the charge points are installed in the right place and it's equitable for everyone. Will the infrastructure be accessible for those living in more deprived areas, for example? The climate change impact, is it being installed in an area that has a high renewable energy mix or a low renewable energy mix? And the cost, this is going to depend on grid constraints, the adjacency to renewables, is it next to a PV farm, for example, and the time to realise the benefits. How long is it going to take for people to switch to EV in this particular area? And the complexity, the land use, the freeholds, the site contaminated. If we're installing these infrastructure at petrol stations, for example, then what is the cost of the potential cleanup operation in transitioning it through to a rapid charging hub, for example. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to listening to the rest of the presentations and participating in the chat later. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. That was a really great overview of some of the facets that are needed to be considered to really supercharge the EV transition that the world will go through. Our next speaker is Hallie Liao, and it'll be great to hear and understand how the Shenzhen Bus Company has actually implemented the largest EV fleet.
Hi, everyone. Very glad to be here. Speaking on Shenzhen Bus Group's transition process from diesel buses to EVs. So as Luke introduced, that we are the first and the only city in the world right now that is running on pure electric public transportation. So we run around 6,000 electric buses in the city of Shenzhen, being the largest and oldest operator here. And out of the 22,000 electric buses here, and 5,000 out of the 17,000 electric taxis in the city of Shenzhen. So we also operate in cross-border services, travel services between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. For those of you who's not familiar with the city, it's a very, very new city in China. It's known as the tech hub, where most of the major tech companies like Tencent, BYD, Huawei, etc., all these companies are headquartered at. So the city is it has always been very green, benefiting from, as this city that started the reform and opening up policy in China. So it's sort of seen as the testing ground of new technology, new policies in China, which is also, I think it plays a key role in why we became the first city that rolled out this all EV infrastructure, which is we're also seeing being replicated, not just in China and hopefully in other parts of the world as well. And just to speak, I think, can we go on the next slide? I don't think I can do it from here. Yeah, so on the fleet side. So next slide, please. So it has been a very long journey. It took us 10 years from the first time that we trialed in new hybrid buses in 2008. So though a majority of our buses were purchased between 2015 to 2017. And the reason for that was that we wanted to take advantage of the subsidies regime and policy that was provided both by the municipal government in Shenzhen and also the central government in China, which they not only provide subsidies for bus operators and public transports like us, but they were also providing incentives both financially and on the policy level for everyone in the ecosystem. So that means battery manufacturers, car manufacturers, depot construction, everything. So that was the golden period from 2015 to 2020, where we transition all of our fleet. And now we always say, like, purchasing the buses and the cars are the easy part, but the infrastructure building is the difficult part. Especially for us, we had to reroute all our routes to cater to the charging infrastructure because it is a total revamp of the both your operations and also your depot management, as you will have to coordinate with grid companies, governments on land supplies, particularly in places in big cities like Shenzhen, where land price is astronomically high. So these still remains on as challenge for us even till today, even though we just retired our first batch of buses, 800 of them that have run a full life cycle, which is 8 years. last year, and happy to say that we have not come across any major issues, but it has been a long journey. Next slide, please. Okay, next one. So we use most of our buses are the BYD K8 model, and we also use other manufacturers like Nanjing Golden Dragon, etc. And well, I think it's important to know that when we first started trialing the technology, it was very nascent, and I think it was very crucial that we were working closely with the manufacturers. That any technical feedback that we had, we gave it back to our OEMs, and then they can upgrade it accordingly. So I think we had a stats. We gave BYD, I think, around 700 technical feedbacks, and in the course of the 2 years of the first deployment, they adopted around 500 technical feedback. And our chairman would always say, you know, his biggest mistake was not personally invested in the BYD shares, but you know, we're very happy to see how the ecosystem and the technology has truly evolved in the last 10 years. And I think Australia and other of our international partner, you guys are in much better position than we were 10 years ago. Next slide, please. And we have a central fleet operation management as now when we are monitoring the buses, one of the key part is to monitor the state of charge and integrate that into our dispatching systems. So we think that this is an important but also a very beneficial step into taking into autonomous driving vehicle fleet in the future, not in the near future, but when it's ready for public transportation, then we already have a system in place that is closely monitored and be dispatched with the mindset that cars are automatically analyzed and optimized. Next slide, please. Next, I think these are slightly more technical, and so from our department, so I run the international development department at Shenzhen Bus Group, and a lot of the work that we do here is actually not only help governments internationally on setting up a roadmap on electrification, as I think majority of the countries have a clear timeline on when they want to achieve it by, and but have no idea where to start. So we help them on a strategy level and on implementation level, how to do what type of the buses and charging terminals that you would need to procure, and also on the operations and training staff level, how do you turn your engineers and mechanical engineers when you're running diesel cars to electrical engineers, which is what most of our staff right now have been trained to do. So I think it's a long journey, but we find this transition truly humbling and very meaningful, as you guys, anyone who has been to Shenzhen, I think would be quite impressed with the air quality here and the environment. Probably still not as good as Australia, but for a dense city in China, I think we're being seen as sort of the example of how electric vehicles has truly changed the environment. So yeah, so I think this is the brief introduction that I would do here, and happy to answer any questions in the panel.
Thank you, Hallie. That's just a hugely impressive demonstration of really what is possible when there's an alignment with, you know, government policy, incentives, and then also corporate ambition, and the delivery of such a huge fleet of EVs, you know, enables us all around the globe to see what is possible with alignment. So thank you, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions from the audience for you and some of the other speakers on this. You'll see the Q&A box, hopefully in WebEx, and so please put your questions in there. We hope to have 30 minutes for a good Q&A with the panelists and presenters. Up next, we have David Maleki to present to us from the New South Wales Government.
Great, thanks, Luke. Hello, everyone. Very pleased to be here this afternoon and following some great speakers. So the focus of my talk is going to be on light vehicles, so passenger and light commercial vehicles. This is my area of expertise and our area of focus in my area at the moment. And so New South Wales is also doing work on moving to zero emissions vehicles. So very inspiring to hear from Hallie there around it already being achieved in a city, but across New South Wales around 8,000 buses. But also looking at other vehicle types like trains, ferries, and so forth in our future transport strategy that our transport department runs. So we're kind of looking broadly, but this focuses on light vehicles. As I start, I invite the people on the call to try and envisage a future where vehicles are all electric, whether that's powered by hydrogen or batteries, where they're powered by renewable energy exclusively, and where they are cleverly integrated with the grid, so there's a two-way flow of energy. And that future vision is something that's somewhat difficult to imagine sometimes as human nature to be stuck in the BAU and not see that future clearly. And particularly in an isolated kind of island state that we are in Australia, of course, but that I'm very proud to be part of working for a government that has seen that vision and is taking decisive action to kind of get us along the way. So next slide, please. I was asked to speak about the why government, and Simon spoke about this a little bit earlier, touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think there's 5 things for why government intervention is really important. And the first is that government can plan for the transition and take a helicopter view on what's needed without necessarily commercial interests being involved, without those kind of approaches being dictated by certain perverse outcomes, but looking at it more broadly. Secondly, we know that government intervention works. So globally, in jurisdictions where every $1,000 that are invested into subsidies for support for EVs, either euros or dollars or pounds, we know that that has impact and that it increases EV sales share by about 5% in Europe and Canada and the EU. So we know that it works, and we know that ongoing and right-sized government intervention and policies provide policy certainty, and it creates that policy certainty so that industry can do what they do best and invest in charging infrastructure, invest in innovation, and so forth. Most of the charging infrastructure at the high-powered end in Australia has been co-funded or seed-funded by government, and that's largely so far through the Renewable Energy Agency at the Commonwealth level, but now more states are getting involved. And that's appropriate. There are relatively poor returns on investment for higher capacity charges, mostly through the capital costs, that's what has been touched on today, but also the low level of uptake of electric vehicles, meaning there's a long lead time for revenue return. So deployment is slow, and it's entirely appropriate for government to be part of that and the initial stages in an infant market. The fourth point is around information provision. So we know there's a significant information asymmetry around the shift to electric vehicles, a lot of misinformation out there about electric vehicles, depending where you are and who you listen to. But it's incumbent upon governments and government departments to provide clear basic information to consumers and citizens around these new technologies. And a great example is total cost of ownership. It's a new way, it's obviously a way of thinking that's fairly common in business and with clean technologies, but it's really critical to the vehicle purchase decision. And now that we have electric vehicles that are significantly cheaper in the operational phase compared to their ICE counterparts, it's a real thing, and that thinking has to change for consumers. So it's an educational piece there. And finally, there are a significant amount of benefits that can be captured and are there for the taking. But a lot of communal effort needs to be made to capture those. There's obviously individual benefits from a cost point of view for the individual driver and purchaser, but there are broader benefits to society, such as, I mean, Hallie touched on cleaner air, but there's also grid stability. There's things like reduced need for foreign oil, particulate and greenhouse gas emissions reductions, which are societal. And so government's well placed to push for those across the board. So next slide. Thank you. So key barriers, we've heard some of them already. They're very common globally, and they're of course here in New South Wales as well. So the quick summary is that there's cost, there's choice, that's model availability. Simon touched on that. Range anxiety reflected in public charging availability, and then the integration of electric vehicles in the grid, really well expressed with the buses. It's step one is getting the vehicle there, step two is integrating it and having charging available, and then that information issue I spoke about. So all those barriers combined create an environment where transition is difficult, but it's very important because in New South Wales, and this was reflected nationally as well, the transport sector is the second largest in terms of greenhouse gas emission and the fastest growing over the past 2 decades as well. Next slide. So in New South Wales, we've mid last year released our electric vehicle strategy. It's got a raft of initiatives, an investment of nearly 600 million over the next 4 years, with an orientation to really drive sales, but also to create confidence by building out charging networks and so forth across the state, with a kind of stated ambition so that our state will be the easiest and most affordable place to buy and operate an electric vehicle in New South Wales. So if we move to the next slide, at the time of release, our Treasurer and Minister for Energy outlined our ambition, and it's a sales ambition around, it's not a sales ban, I should say, pointing out one of Simon's points, but it's an ambition around sales being 50% by 2030 and the vast majority by 2035. And that speaks to the need to make that technology change in order to achieve abatement goals. And we know that vehicles stay on the road for 10, 15 years more. And so making that change in the early stages will lead to emissions abatement in the longer term. So next slide. As we constructed the strategy, there are a number of principles that we used to identify where the hotspots were. Those barriers, it's laser focused on those barriers to uptake, and really inserting ourselves into the current problems to uptake. Again, consistent with our objectives of net zero emissions by 2050, 50% emissions reductions by 2030, that third point there, and capturing those benefits. The final point for New South Wales is that it shifts over our taxation system a bit down the track. I'll get to that. From the fuel excise, which is currently collected at the Commonwealth level on liquid fuels, through to a road user charge on electric vehicles. So that shift in revenue there. And although these principles applying to a state government policy, some of them are quite, for larger organisations, other bodies like that who are thinking of that transition and doing transition planning, some of these do apply to those organisations as well. So thank you. Next slide. So the first point of attack here in the big barriers around cost, we've abolished stamp duty in New South Wales on EVs under $78,000, and there are $3,000 rebates on the table for EVs under $68,750. So combined, that's around $4,000 to $6,000 price reduction on a new EV, which is a way to helping that model availability and price barrier that we see at the moment. Alongside that, we're supporting fleets, and it's important that we support fleets because we know that they're more economically rationalist, they drive more kilometres, and they turn over into the second-hand market more quickly. And so over a few years, we have $105 million to support fleets to shift to EVs by closing that total cost of ownership gap between the new EV and the vehicle they would have purchased otherwise. But we're also looking at our own fleet. So we've got 12,000 passenger vehicles in New South Wales. I think it's the biggest fleet in the Southern Hemisphere. It's an enormous fleet, and we're looking to transition that. It's a funded program out through over the rest of the decade. And again, between all of these, it will create a flourishing second-hand market, which is essentially absent at the moment in New South Wales. So next slide. We're also focused on charging infrastructure. So obviously the two go together. They need to go up in lockstep essentially. And these maps just describe quickly the major roads in New South Wales by which we're focused on, with a $171 million investment over a few years. So if we jump to the next slide, our commitment for fast charging, so fast and ultra fast charging, and when our definition of ultra fast is 350 kilowatt charges. So the commitment in New South Wales is to ensure that we co-fund industry to build, own and operate these stations at 100 kilometre intervals on major highways, about 2,000 kilometres worth of highways, but also in city areas where there's limited off-street parking, and then on major commuter corridors, so every 5 kilometres across there. And complementing that is funding towards regional tourist destination type sites for AC chargers, many thousands of AC chargers to be supported in those regions, and build out that network and provide charging optionality for drivers to make it ubiquitous. And that's really important, I think, as Simon touched on before. So alongside our stamp duty elimination, there's a sweetener of transit lane access to battery electric vehicle and hydrogen vehicles. That's in place now. We know that works in other jurisdictions, so that's currently available for at least this year, if not longer. And then that final piece is around that road user charge, which I mentioned. So in New South Wales, we've chosen to defer that through to mid-2027, or when sales are 30% of, when EVs are 30% of new sales, I should say, whichever comes first. And that charge will apply to both battery electric vehicles and plug-in PHEVs as well. And that will part fund this work as well. So incentivize first, then create our road user system second. Thank you. Next slide. All right, what government can do is generate insights. One example of that in New South Wales is around a fast charging master plan that we've developed. We published it in September, so it can be kind of publicly accessed, data can be downloaded out of it and so forth. And what we did was look at all of the different features and elements of data which make up a good charging zone. And we've identified 400 of those zones across New South Wales, considering all of these kind of features. And that could be traffic volume, substation capacity, take up, and so forth. By looking at it, allowed us again take that helicopter view, look down at the whole state, see what was optimal. We're going to be able to use it to direct our grant funding, but also it's really important for the industry and also charge point operators and other planners of various ilks to understand what that network should and could look like over the next 10 years. Alongside that, charging performance. So that kind of taking a number of electric vehicles that are available in market, fully electric vehicles, and test their charging performance at charges of all kinds, from 7 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts. We've got a technical report which we should be releasing imminently, which kind of describes that charging performance. And it's really important to see how these vehicles work in the wild and how charging performance works. And that's all great information for industry and the public. So next slide. Thank you. This is my final slide, so touching on the information side of things. Again, lots of areas where information is needed, and in the next couple of weeks, as an example, we're releasing a whole suite of information for building actors in the building space, so tenants, building managers and operators and so forth, to both understand the scale of the opportunity and the costs and the barriers, but also to take action to make and retrofit their buildings to be electric vehicle ready from an electrical infrastructure point of view. Alongside that, we're going to be delivering around 30 test drive days with big partner organisations across the state over the next 18 months or so, and that's exposure to electric vehicles, it's promotion of electric vehicles and their benefits, and dispelling some of the myths. And then finally, I'll just touch on the offset scheme that we're looking to launch in the second half of the year. And again, this one's around allowing all New South Wales drivers of light vehicles the voluntary opportunity to offset their emissions, their annual emissions from the previous 12-month period at the point of registration. So if they can't afford to move to electric vehicles, they can offset their existing emissions if there's no model available that suits them and so forth. And it gets that thinking around the performance of their vehicle and the need to shift as well. So that's me. I'm really looking forward to the panel chat. Thanks for having me. And hopefully we can get other states in Australia to keep going and pushing forward on the transition. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation, David. And it's great to see the leadership from New South Wales and some of the innovative policies that you're putting in place to really get the traction of EV ownership, both in the corporate world and also for the consumers. Our last panelist, Luke, is going to talk to us how his platform is helping facilitate getting people into electric vehicles. So, Luke, take it away.
Thank you, Luke, and yeah, great to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. Let me just share my slides. Yeah, so look, thanks for hosting this today. Look, I think Australia weirdly is quite well positioned to accelerate now in this space. You know, I think I'll say we've watched the rest of the world take the lead, and now we're learning the lessons and starting to apply those in Australia. So look, I think the time is really good for this discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about outbound today and how we see this future playing out. We're a new entrant into the electric fleet market over here, so a little bit at the other end of the scale from Shenzhen and Hallie's experience, but also facing kind of similar challenges today that will be very different in 5 years and beyond. My background's across sustainable energy and transport, and was previously in transport modeling world, so thinking about how we shift people away from ownership, away from traditional vehicles onto public transport and wider systems. So really thinking and coming at this challenge from a systems point of view, and not just thinking around shifting ownership of electric cars. So this is what we're doing at Outbound. We're partnering with property developers and operators to make shared e-mobility an amenity. That applies across residential, commercial, hotels. That also applies across master plan communities, within mobility hubs, within service stations, that really help communities have access to electric cars, bikes and scooters as an amenity. So not necessarily to own and have access to that the whole time, but just being able to be have flexible access to vehicles when they need them. More broadly, we're looking at trying to enable sustainable mobility. So yes, absolutely relevant for this conversation, where all electric vehicles, and probably only ever will be electric vehicles. Partially they make sense operationally for us in our model, but also it's kind of the right thing for us to be doing. We then take that a little bit further and ensure we're climate positive by offsetting a lot of the emissions that we use during the service. And more broadly, we're tackling car dependency. It would be a real shame, actually, as we go through this electric vehicle revolution, if we end up trading out the existing fleet private vehicles for privately owned electric cars. And actually, a lot of the environmental benefits that we see from shifting to mobility would be very small. So very focused on providing easy access to electric vehicles. The platform we've got when we go and work with our private partners is a sharing app for being able to access different types of vehicles. We've then got an all-inclusive fleet, so we do everything from maintenance and insurance and all the charging around that too. The key thing here is that we tailor that fleet depending on the communities that we're working with, because certain vehicles and vehicle types are not right for different communities. So we try and get a really good understanding of demographics, location, and scale when we deploy these sorts of services. We also wrap the chargers into those. There's a lot of the buildings and communities we work with don't have existing charging infrastructure, so where possible we wrap that into the solution that we provide, and we provide a lot of the operations. We are starting to work with partners around how they can help operate these sort of services as part of the residential experience that they provide with their buildings. So why the hell are we doing this? Well, we're seeing a bit of a shift in how developers think about the new world, partially around EVs, but also around mobility more generally. There's a couple of more extreme cases on the screen here, and we're seeing cul-de-sac in the US offer mobility services to lure car-free renters. Now, car-free is something that's been talked about for a long time in literature, but actually we're seeing sort of mobility abundance being the sort of right buzzwords around this, and how we can help people live, work, stay in these new communities and not need to own cars, and hopefully being able to access electric vehicles when they need them for the different trip types. Similarly, Sidewalk Labs promised a lot around some of their works in Toronto, and actually a lot of the thinking and IP that was developed through that, I'm sure, will be applied more broadly. And then locally, we've seen Beulah down in Melbourne look to host an auto club as part of their new development. And there's about 50 vehicles they're planning for that site. So if you live, work, stay in our community, just access our vehicles on demand. You don't need to come and own your own vehicles, which is really, really cool. And again, a really important part as we progress here. But that's really hard for most developers and partners to implement on day one. Car ownership in Australia directly and actually more widely is pretty deep rooted. It's pretty risky for cities to allow car-free developments now, and indeed developers as well. Although that has changed, and we are seeing a lot more activity in the car-free development world now. The key thing actually on that is, what does the transition plan look like? You know, if we could put in 1 or 2 chargers, 1 or 2 shared vehicles now, what does that enable, and what does that transition look like over the next 5 to 10 years? And how do we prepare our communities, our properties, our developments for that transition? Because it could be quite substantial. And what are the wider impacts that enables? You know, does that free up some of the parking? What else can we do with that? And so these are all things that developers are starting to think about as we make this transition, and how they can future-proof their developments. These are some of the industry challenges that we see as we scale, and the key bit under there is collaboration and partnerships. A lot of it, we need to be working closely with partners around on this call to help us solve a lot of these. Constrained vehicle supply is a pretty hot topic at the moment, and we've got vehicles on order that are sort of 7 to 12 months away, which is a real challenge for a small business, let alone everyone else in this sort of world. We hope that will be sorted, but we have to work quite closely with manufacturers to ensure we get good supply. We're already seeing some constrained energy networks around this, generally putting or retrofitting 1 to 2 chargers within existing properties is okay, but we have to consider what the impact of putting 10 is, or 20 in some of these larger establishments. And we are seeing the provision in new builds happening now, where the wiring is going in and the grid connection and capacity is available to scale up. But we sort of worry about a lot of the existing properties in our cities. The charging optimization will be something important for us, and partly to enable a really good level of service, but also wider opportunities, which I'll come on to on the next slide. And then evolving regulatory landscape. You know, at the moment, we're a little bit disjointed across states, as David kind of pointed out. So us being able to have an understanding and a roadmap and being able to adapt as we go is going to be really, really important. And then the wider opportunities, same subheading, it's all around collaboration partnerships. If we can get the core service right and we can get people moving in EVs, you know, we are looking at how we enable ancillary grid services. You know, if we can help balance the grid at certain times of day, once we've got quite a significant fleet, you know, let's say, you know, bus services like Shenzhen, if we end up having quite a significant fleet, you know, we can play in that sort of world, which is really, really interesting. And then more at a local level, how can we work quite closely with the buildings that we operate in to help them manage their load and power at different times of day. Another area that's quite interesting is around the carbon credits, and we think there might be new revenue streams enabled by utilising EV charging at different times of day. Partly benefits the properties rather than us as the fleet, but we're part of the enabler for that revenue stream. And then direct renewables procurement is another really good opportunity. And once you've got a big fleet of electric vehicles, actually doing that can be significant cost savings, you know, across multiple years. So yeah, you know, appreciate we're pretty early, and a lot of this is quite visionary, but you know, really hoping that we can get a lot of this right and learn from the rest of the world as we scale up. Really looking forward to continuing the discussion.
Thanks for that, Luke. That's a really exciting proposition, Outbound, and you know how your business may really enable the take up of this and make it easy for corporations to get into it. Thank you to all the presenters. We're going to move into a bit of a panel discussion and take some questions from the floor also. I guess to kick that off, I'll throw to Greg Steele. Greg, with your global mobility view and lens, a lot of countries around the globe have fuel tax and need to pivot to some other system. And we heard from David, you know, a road user charge. Can you give us a bit of a global lens on who's doing this well and how corporations, how governments have gone about getting off that fuel tax?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. And I'll throw to David for comment too, because it's a huge issue as the world tries to wean itself off oil. Australia and the US are two of the worst with as far as fuel tax is concerned. Australia's been very slow off the mark. And New South Wales is, I believe, the first to really have a crack at this. In my opinion, it should be a federal solution to this, so each state doesn't start doing its own thing. New Zealand, very interestingly, introduced a sort of road user charge for heavy vehicles back in the 70s, early 80s, so well advanced. And, some technology is required if it's a weight or mass and distance road user charge, then there needs to be more technology fitted to cars to actually do that. And I think more than anything, it has to be fair. And I think I saw that word in David's comments. You can't start charging someone exorbitant road user charge in a regional area when someone in the city is relatively cheap. It's got to be fair. So I wouldn't mind David's comments on that. So the Scandinavian countries, once again, quite advanced. The electric fleet in say the Netherlands is nearing 25 to 30%, whereas Australia it's 1 or 2%. So they've had to really solve these issues many years ago. So still in front of us, it's a very big political issue, and that's the constraint. It's seen as another tax. So there is a pivot point and an optimal time to switch over. So I wouldn't mind getting David's comments on that as well.
Yeah, sure. Not a problem. Yeah, and I agree with everything you've said. I think it's a political issue. We're actually, I think, the third state. Victoria already has a road user charge in place at the moment. South Australia, the same plans as New South Wales have. So they followed us, and all of the states have mirrored each other in terms of the cents per kilometre that we're proposing. We've got our road user charge is enshrined in legislation already at the top level, so that was important in terms of driving these incentives into the market. But we've got the luxury of time to build this up and consult properly on it and ensure that there are no perverse outcomes from a user charge. And you've raised some of those, private driving on private properties, regional versus urban settings, and so forth. I think it's entirely appropriate to have a fair way of charging users for their use of the road. And it plays out in different forms around the place, and electric vehicles shouldn't be an exception to that, but we're in a transitional phase right now. And so that's why New South Wales took the particular approach of deferring that until EVs are more ubiquitous, there's more models, there's choice, price parity is either reached or closer to be reached, where then a user charge isn't as much of an issue as it is probably right now. And we see that in Victoria, lots of pushback. There's a High Court challenge, I understand, at the moment on the charge and so forth. So it's got to be done carefully, done right, done fairly. It's an appropriate thing to have in place.
Excellent. Thanks for that, David. I'm going to throw this one to Hallie. There's a question from the audience, from Pascal. Any views on optimised charging across the entire transport ecosystem? Trains, light vehicle, EV, zero emissions buses, as there's all going to be different timings of that. It'd be really great to get some insight from you on how Shenzhen has solved this, because you've got such a large, diverse fleet, and how you've gone around solving that optimization of timing and charging.
That's a great question, and a very, very difficult one. So I don't know about in New South Wales, but in Shenzhen, we have different electricity prices across the day. So there's the peak period and the trough period. So we charge majority of our buses at night when the electricity prices is about 1/4 the price comparing to during the day. So that is also responding to sort of the government's initiatives on both like cutting down and easing the grid pressure during the day, as we are a huge industrial user. And we also took it upon ourselves to develop new technologies where we have these chargers with 4 plugs, and you can distribute what pressure and the time period that you have according to the plugs, so that we can charge 4 buses simultaneously, which was I think the first technology that was put into market a few years ago. So, and we also had a dispatching system that was decentralized across all our subsidiary companies, which they have to come up with their own charging regimes on how to optimize the operations, and B, also how to save on the electricity bills that they are being designated. So in that way, because we are running such a large fleet, there's no way for us to design them one by one. So I think it really just took time and experience, you know, at 8 years of running it, and now it's still not perfect yet, but we're getting there. And charging definitely is I would say, is the most difficult part in the infrastructure planning.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was speaking with some of our colleagues out of the US that are just helping a local government transition a bus fleet, and the electrical demand on just one bus fleet and changing only 25% was in the order of 15 megawatts. And that really creates some significant challenges in urban districts. We've got another question here from David Eels, and I'll throw this one to Simon. Do you see the supply of lithium as a constraint to the EV vehicle production and supply?
Well, ultimately, yes, because everything's finite, right? So we need to make sure that we're still investing in research on solid state batteries as well. There's not going to be one solution to our problems on this planet, and certainly battery electric vehicles aren't the only solution. Lots of people are advocates of hydrogen, and I'm sure there's going to be new technologies coming along in the future. So it certainly is a constraint, and obviously cobalt as well. They've got their challenges in terms of mining and extraction. Significantly less, though, than all of the world problems that we see from the production and pollution from extraction of oil, of course, in my opinion. But we still need to be investing in research in terms of how can we move away from these precious metals and invest more in perhaps solid state and other forms of propulsion that might come from new technologies.
Thanks for that, Simon. Yeah, there's that mythical 3rd or 4th generation battery breakthrough that we need. And, you know, I've been reading up on Dr. Goodenough, John B. Goodenough's papers and research on solid state, and there's some really interesting stuff that may come out of that. Nobel prize-winning scientist, I think he's in his 90s and still studying. We've got a really great question here from Marcel, and it's multifaceted and there's a lot in it. So I'm going to throw to both Luke and also David. I'm interested in the panel's view on potential gaps and opportunities in planning a total EV transition, e.g. mandating charging solar in new buildings, including residential, and using an EV as a home battery. This is a very different model to recharging or you know, the traditional refueling at petrol stations.
It's a good question. Lots in there, but it's a good question, and there's lots to do. Obviously, as we move, it's a different beast. Electric vehicle with different opportunities. Where can I start? Well, maybe on the buildings front, in New South Wales. Nationally in Australia, there's a national construction code which dictates the requirements for new builds and what needs to be included at that stage. And that's being updated this year, and states will reflect it in their planning instruments. So New South Wales is pushing quite hard to have an ambitious approach there around the electrical infrastructure required in new builds to allow EVSE to be installed within those buildings. And so that's coming up pretty quickly. Again, I think that's new builds. That's one side of the picture, and retrofitting is the other side. It's much more expensive to retrofit a building for EVs than it is within a new build. Mandating, I think, is it depends where we are in the transition as to when mandating makes sense, because it doesn't always make sense to do it too early because it's either too expensive or too impractical or what have you. But at some point, it does become a good idea to mandate and regulate for things. So there's no like one size fits all answer to that. But the part of the transition that I find fascinating is that charge management and charging optimization side of things. There's opportunities around virtual power plants and doing it at scale, which I think really can unlock a whole lot of opportunities. And that can be through regulation and using those gross levers to incentivize people to charge at certain times across a geographic area, or it could be particular incentives run out through your VPP operator or retailer or what have you, which can drive individual decision making around when to charge and how much to put back into the grid when that becomes more of a thing. So that's my quick summary, Luke.
Yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting opportunity, and we're seeing a lot of developers engage with this and generally keen to play. There's also a reason why a lot of service station operators are worried about this future, because of exactly that. You can get most of the energy needs from being at home. And so, yeah, if we get this right, and actually a lot of the trip types that we see for our service might not even need public charging availability. We should be able to have enough energy at home in the residences to enable us to do the 90% of the trip types that we see. So I think being able to unlock the first stage of that, which is, can people have the right? Are they satisfied in their mobility needs? Can they move around enough? And then around that, let's try and decarbonize grid or have local solar as far as possible. And then we can unlock the wider benefits around home battery. But number one is, can people still fulfill their transportation needs? I think so. Yeah, huge opportunities there.
Yeah, and Luke, while you're talking, Outbound has a number of installations. One of the questions that have come through is, how much does it cost to refill or charge an EV from 0 to 100 in layman's terms?
Yeah, so we actually don't do 0 to 100 very often. We see a lot of people go out for an hour, a couple of hours, come back, plug in, and be ready for the next person, which is where some of the smart charging will be really important for us. At the moment, it's sort of $10 to $15 to fill up where we are. It's really not much. We generally operate 22 kilowatt AC chargers. We don't at this point see the need for anything faster because of where we are and how they're used. We might see, as utilization goes up, that we do need to flex that, and therefore pricing will go up. But yeah, so it's not in comparison to traditional fueling, especially the way fuel prices are going at the moment. It's far cheaper.
Excellent. And far cheaper and potentially a lot cleaner if it's generated by green electricity. Chris Marsh has asked a question around, how effective has bi-directional charging been? And I think by bi-directional charging, he means both charging the battery and then utilizing the battery to power back into the grid, known as vehicle to grid or vehicle to grid enablement. And there's a few vehicles on the market that can do that in regions where the grid is trying to manage energy consumption. I'll throw to you on that, Simon, and then possibly touch with Hallie if that's something that's been implemented in Shenzhen.
Sure, there's been lots of talk about vehicle to grid or vehicle to X or vehicle to home, as it's sometimes called as well. And in my opinion, it's still really in its infancy. But the general concept the vehicle to grid is that you're basically lending your battery to the grid operator to benefit from the energy stored in your car, and it helps balance the grid. So it's a benefit to them, and as a result of you lending them that power, then you will get paid for that use. The vehicle to grid piece, the vehicle to X or vehicle to home, is a great idea insofar as if you've got PVs, solar panels on your roof, and you then connect your car into your home system, then you see this sort of perfect scenario where you're effectively charging your car from your solar panels, and the battery can then be used also conversely to boil your kettle in your home. So you've got a great sort of circular economy going on there, but it is still it's still early days actually for vehicle to grid. There's lots and lots of projects going on. Can I just touch on one of the things that we were talking about earlier around the cost of charging, because there is a challenge for everyone here when you're developing infrastructure, and that's the challenge for providing an equitable solution, a fair solution for everyone, because the people who have the benefit can afford houses with off-street parking will always be able to benefit from cheaper electricity. So they're always going to be able to charge their car more affordably than if you're only able to charge your car at a public charger. And if you only have a rapid charging hub powered by one of the charge point operators who are going to charge you a lot per kilowatt hour, you're at a disadvantage, and that needs to be sorted out at a federal level, in my opinion, and that can it's really important. Otherwise, there's just going to be a two-tier solution. Those who are able to afford to be almost to pay less. So it's that does need to be tackled, and I think that needs to be tackled everywhere. That's not a problem specific to one country.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Simon. And we're seeing with the large amount of solar that has come into the Australian residential market that it has created a two-tiered system: those that have PV solar and those that don't, and those that get the benefit of that very cheap electricity, and others that don't. Hallie, I'll throw to you just to check. I don't anticipate Shenzhen is putting their energy back out of their vehicles, because it's probably about getting them back on the road and back picking up customers. But is that something that's in the roadmap going forward?
You're absolutely right. We did trialed a company with the bidirectional charging. It just didn't really make sense for us because the current charging regime works, and we were able to keep the price quite low with the smart charging, where you can adjust the rates and the charging time. And then I think the company that we trialed with went bankrupt a while later. No, but it's something that we're looking into in the future, I think, when there's more demand. And currently, so a lot of people ask us what we're doing with our used batteries. So now we're actually looking into put into use the used batteries for energy storage purposes. And now I think that would be one of the use that we wanted to explore in the future.
Yeah, there's some really exciting opportunities once we get to that end of life of the vehicles and their batteries, what we can utilize those batteries for. And there's some great ideas around large scale embedded batteries to support the renewables in the grid. The next question that I have here, I'll throw to David. And David, you mentioned in your presentation around hydrogen and what role it plays in the transition for New South Wales. You know, how will hydrogen play in the decarbonisation along with battery electric vehicles for decarbonising Australia?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So I think from a government point of view, it's not necessarily about picking winners. So our incentive schemes and rebates are available for both fuel cell and battery electric vehicles. And there's a lot of focus on hydrogen as a future economy, so the hydrogen economy at the national level and the state level as well. We've got a big investment and a big strategy for hydrogen in New South Wales, but it's about creating the enabling infrastructure, the electrolyzers, and so forth, and the refuelers to be able to create a hydrogen economy from scratch. Whereas we have an electricity system already. It's well established, it's been around for ages. So I guess a few facts from the light, and picking winners. I think it'd be a brave person to pick winners and say this is how it's going to be in 10 years, given technology changes. There's different applications, obviously, where that suit more towards hydrogen versus batteries and so forth. But the kind of facts are in the passenger space and the light space. The facts are kind of talking for themselves a little bit, and at this point, and so if we look at kind of sales last year in Australia, we're hitting the tens of thousands for battery electric vehicles, but I think there were about 40 hydrogen powered vehicles sold in Australia. So not much choice. And I suppose there's a handful of hydrogen refuelers already in Australia, only a handful, but every PowerPoint is an electric vehicle charging station essentially, and there's billions of them. So I suppose we think dwell on that point.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really interesting because there's a lot of discussion around hydrogen, and obviously it's a great medium to store renewable energy as a big battery that we can then export potentially or use at a different time of the day. And it seems like hydrogen stacks up a lot more in that heavy freight and also potentially trains as a fuel source. Greg, I'll throw to you for a bit of a global lens. Some countries, and you mentioned this when talking about the road taxes, some countries are clearly further ahead than others when it comes to zero emissions vehicles. What is it that really sets them apart, and what lessons can Australia learn from those countries?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned, and look, we only did 12 countries, and as Simon said, we're expanding that to a few others. But leading the pack was to those Nordic countries, including Netherlands, and it's the will, the desire, the impact of climate change, which is very real because they're live below sea level. So the imperative there, and a relatively wealthy country, funnily enough, off the back of oil in the past. But the intent of government to set that good policy, being in Europe with lots of vehicle manufacturers, so plentiful supply of choice in electric vehicles, into the hundreds, where in Australia we have 30 or 40 choice of models, where there's literally hundreds in Europe, and enough private sector initiative through those policies to build the infrastructure. So, as I said before, we're seeing 25 to 30% of the fleet already being of new sales being electric vehicles, where Australia is 1 or 2%. So, going back to Simon's and the piece of work we did, and it varies between Australia at the lower end and Netherlands, and that for me, government leadership and their intent in getting to net zero carbon as quickly as they can, and the will to do that.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that, Greg. So I'll throw this one to Luke. What's the ambition and appetite of the corporates that you're talking with to finance this? Are you still seeing a barrier, or is there a real appetite to see their businesses and customers and consumers have a net zero option in mobility?
Yeah, good question. Definitely seeing an appetite for funding. A lot of them are seeing it a bit of a differentiator in market. You know, I think consumer ethics are changing a lot given pandemic and lots of other things happening around the world. Actually, climate change is more real and more impactful than ever. So you know, a lot of the private partners we deal with have huge ESG pushes and are really living a lot of those values that they're saying to the world. So yeah, we're definitely seeing investment. I mean, the transition and the key thing here is going to be it's all good doing one or two and engaging a little bit to tick some of the ESG boxes and promote yourselves in that world, but how do we then scale that up and make it a full scale transition? That's going to be the key bit, and look, the finances around that do become quite challenging. But again, flipping, you know, even around some of the vehicles and stuff, if we look at total cost of ownership and we start to play through multiple years of having this sort of service, it can become quite quickly cost beneficial to people. So yeah, look, huge appetite. People want to engage, and they're seeing they have to be at the forefront of it now because this world's going to change quite significantly over the next 10 years. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that, Luke. It's exciting, and we're seeing a number of the corporates really set their ambitions in writing and publishing those, and it's now about starting to implement that and understand the impacts for the infrastructure and how to help organisations pivot. There's a question that's come through, and I'll throw this one to Simon. Where can I find more information about EVs that have the ability to be used as a home battery? I think, Simon, this is referring again to that vehicle to the grid. There's been a couple vehicles that are advertised as vehicle to grid. I'm not sure whether we've got the regulatory approval here in Oz, and I might throw to David after Simon answers that to see if you can enlighten us on the regulatory side of vehicle to grid.
So I think we need to look back at the what's being provided by the OEMs actually in terms of that ability. Some are significantly more advanced in this area than others. Nissan have been investing heavily in vehicle to grid capability for years. They do operate sometimes on a slightly different platform, but I think yeah, have a look at the OEMs, the car makers first, in terms of what they're going to allow in terms of the bi-directional capability. I think that's the important thing. And just one other point, Tesla offer, I'm sure many other OEMs offer it as well, but a wall box battery solution as well. And I know, and I think Nissan do as well offer a battery. But yeah, it'd be worth checking out the car makers directly.
Yeah, thanks for that, Simon. David, did the vehicle to grid portion play a role in the mapping out the opportunities for New South Wales?
So we have, I think it's early days. I think a few other people have said that early days for vehicle to grid and vehicle to load and so forth. Our focus is in the strategy as it is now is on smart chargers, so the enabling technology to allow for that down the track, but there's also bi-directional chargers. So in Australia, just in recent weeks, actually, the Australian standards for bi-directional chargers were approved through. So there is some regulatory standards type work that has to happen up front, and that was a long process, I understand, but that's at least that part's now in play. We're doing investigatory work, and so is the Commonwealth. So they're running a number of trials around various ways that vehicles can be used to interact with the electricity system. And I think the findings of that work will kind of start to inform the kind of regulatory changes, if any, that are needed to enable it. But I think it's about enabling it and about optimizing it as well. And that might be around standards, it might be around tariff rules, and so forth. And those processes don't move terrifically fast, but I think as it's a technology question. As more and more vehicles come into market and they're able to do it, and the charges come as well, and their prices drop, then rules will start to become required, and so that's when they'll start to be put in place.
Excellent. Thank you, David. One last question for Hallie before I wrap up with a quick fire to all the panelists. Hallie, you know, having delivered such a huge transition and such a large fleet, can you distill that down to what was the biggest challenge, or was it lots and lots of little learnings along the way?
Great question. I will start with lots and lots of challenges along the way. The biggest one, obviously, on the infrastructure side, which I have mentioned earlier in my presentation. I would say that the depot management and the revamp has been the most challenging for us in Shenzhen, because it's very particular to the land scarcity and having such a large scale fleet to reroute everything, to take that into account. But I suppose that in a smaller area, this would relatively be easier. But I think in metropolitan areas, the challenge of really optimizing your operations with the existing depot that you have has been difficult. So now we are looking into building more multi-story, multi-purpose depots, because I think the good and interesting part about changing these petrol stations, which used to be quite dirty, relatively noisy, attracts a lot of complaints from nearby residents. Now with the EV charging depots, they're much cleaner, much quieter, and newer and nicer. So we're actually considering turning them. Actually, we have turned one of our new depots into office space with gyms and cafeteria, cafes for our taxi drivers to rest and to recharge there while they're waiting for 2 to 3 hours charging downtime that is eating into their paycheck normally. So we want to really take advantage of the characteristics that we have now with the new charging depot. So I think there's a lot of innovation that we can look into now as the landscape changes. So hopefully that we can share our experiences, and you guys don't have to repeat some of the mistakes that we had.
Yeah, thank you, Hallie. That's some really great insights. I guess we're coming up to time, and I guess just a quick fire question to all of the panelists. If you had a magic wand and you could remove one roadblock or make one change that would really help us supercharge the EV Australian landscape and the transition to net zero, what would it be? I see Luke's sitting forward in anticipation, ready to answer. So I'll throw to you first, Luke, then David, then Simon, Hallie, and a wrap from Greg.
Thanks, mate. It's very easy to say funding, isn't it? Of course we want more funding going into this world, but anything that can enable the lower cost end of the EV market to come through in Australia now is going to be really important, because we are starting to see a two-tier system around the higher end.
Thanks, Luke. And David?
Yeah, my answer is almost the same. I think it's price and its choice down at that lower end. That will really change things, because many consumers will. There's range anxiety, but a lot of people say that's not the thing that bothers me. I just can't afford a car that I want, but I would if I could. And that's repeated consistently in surveys and so on. So I think it's that. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Simon?
It's an easy one. Ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars very soon.
Okay, and look, that's proving a strong incentive over there in the UK. So yeah, really interesting. Thanks for that one. Hallie?
I agree. I think it would be structural support for the government. As I have mentioned, that for us, it was hugely beneficial that the government gave out subsidies and policy support for charging manufacturers, for depot construction companies, so that the private companies did not have to share the burden of building this ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hallie. Greg.
Yeah, along similar lines to Hallie, is the federal government to really get on the front foot and provide a harmonised approach to this, so each state doesn't go off inventing their own or having to invent their own incentives and rules. So the federal government to really get behind this and strongly support EVs.
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're almost right on time. I apologise for the delayed start. Brisbane City is flooded and has meant that I'm working from home here and had some technical challenges. I think I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Luke Keys. I'm the Clients Director that supports the resilience portion of our business, which covers energy transition and topical for the weather that we're having on the east coast of Australia, also water optimisation and the resilience of cities. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon in a virtual sense, wherever you are around the globe and also across Australia. Thank you for your great and interesting questions, and thanks again to the presenters. We're going to be moving into a really exciting net zero Australia, and I'm very hopeful this will be sooner rather than later. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.